don't understand why. I mean, it's a useful tool. I think that the truth is that without it, law enforcement agencies and intelligence services were looking at just endless problems trying to collate and coordinate data. But if you actually look at the terror cells that have been operating in the last year and a half here in Europe, none of this would have affected them.
There's at least one instance where that's not entirely true. One of the Bakrawi brothers who blew himself up in Brussels actually came from Turkey undetected in Belgium, even though he had his name on it.
But he came from Turkey to the Netherlands, and in fact, when he was on his way to the Netherlands, the Dutch authorities were notified that he was on his way to the Netherlands. So it wasn't a question of he was undetected. Where he was undetected was between the Netherlands and Belgium. So that wouldn't have been affected by any of this. I think that what strikes me about this is that you watch movies, you read the press, a lot of the press, and you would think that our lives are being invaded all the time by governments, whether in Europe or in the United States. This shows you how incredibly uncoordinated the governments are when they're trying to gather information. And if you look at the more or less the fine print on this, there's all kinds of checks on the kind of information that can be gathered. They may tell you how big your bag was.
Not religious or ethnic information.
There was none of that, and it doesn't say if you're a Muslim or not. It doesn't say if you're, a lunatic right-winger. It doesn't say anything.
I'm not sure there's a category for that. I don't think there's a line for that on the form.
There should be. Well, no, there isn't for any of those things.
But the other thing is that I'm glad you pointed out that that this guy was actually flagged by the Turkish authorities. Yeah. There's also this. One of the problems is almost too much information, and that. One of the things that we've seen here in Europe, especially, is that a lot of the people were already had files. They were already under surveillance at a previous time, and that basically, because of the amount of people that went to Syria, the authorities were just overwhelmed. They didn't have the resources to actually follow the known people that they wanted to follow. So now you add this element. Again, it's going to be a tool, but they have to have a strategy for how to use the information they're going to get, how to filter it out, how to make sure they're not chasing a whole bunch of false leads and losing the scent that when people are flagged.
I was speaking to someone, I was in Belgium for the attacks, and I was speaking to some of the intelligence officials there, and they were saying the reality is it takes 15 to 20 people to surveil one person. And the Belgian security services, there are maybe 600 people in Belgium who've returned. They just do not have those kind of resources. So their trouble is exactly that. It's not a lack of information. It is internal problems with their security services. The reality is that the UK and France have quite good security services. Not that it stopped the attacks in Paris, but they're quite good.
It has to be said, they're more accustomed to terror attacks on their soil, which Belgium wasn't.
And the rest of Europe, it's really an internal question rather than a data sharing, more information question.
Well, and it really is a human intelligence question. It really is a question of penetrating these cells, getting people on the ground in positions where they can observe and even, in some cases, participate in the planning of operations. That's what you want. One of the problems with modern intelligence is it puts so much emphasis on sharing data, on getting data, on electronic intelligence, signals intelligence, that when it's just a bunch of guys who talk to each other and move on the ground, they really don't have any way to track them.
One of the things that surprises me is French and Belgian authorities have been telling us after the attacks, in particular French authorities, has to be said, that you need the passenger name record, the PNR, this one big single European list. But that's not what was just adopted in Parliament. What was adopted was 28 PNRs, 28 national lists, and that doesn't even include the 15 countries that don't currently have them, that are expected to create them. So if every country has its own list and is not obligated to share the information, which is the case with this new law, you question how useful it might be.
It also took 5 years to get to this point. They're trying to do criminal record sharing. They're trying
we're looking at, we're looking at the man who steered it through Parliament, by the way. Big personal victory for him when he got the law passed. It was, we spoke to him earlier this week. It was very difficult.
No doubt. But, these, not only, as you say, are there 28 separate entities, but this is a tiny chink in a huge battle. And it doesn't seem very doesn't seem very soon that the next victory will be won.
And again, it falls into the pattern for Europe and European, especially counterterrorism cooperation, is that you have these sort of stovepiped and firewalled national capabilities. The problem is getting platforms whereby relevant information has to be shared, is shared effectively, but also, like Christopher said, when tracking Abdeslam's cell phone wouldn't have made any difference. All he had to do was tap on the window. His buddies were right next door. You need people on the ground. You need people within the communities that these people are operating with who have more allegiance to the Belgian state, to Europe, to nailing these guys than to helping them. And unless you have that, none of the information
allegiance to the Belgian state, that's kind of a problematic proposition to begin with. Yes.
The U.S. has PNR, but the Boston, if you study the history of jihadists, it's full of people who should have been flagged and never were caught. The U.S. has a PNR system. Russia flagged the Boston Marathon bombers. They went through. We've had Turkey flagging all sorts of people. Let's just put this very safely in the file of things that politicians have to be seen to be doing something. They really need more Arabic speakers in their intelligence services and human intelligence.
Let me move on to the next topic. We didn't even know really whether to include it. Syrian peace talks. A third round is underway in Geneva to try and agree on a political transition and end 5 years of war that have killed at least 250,000 people. Leila, the first two rounds of peace talks appeared to achieve very little. In fact, they did achieve very little, and that's why we weren't sure whether to talk about it this week. Do you think this is important? Should we be talking about this? Should we even be taking notice?
Well, it's yes and no. I mean, nothing big is going to change on Syria. Russia is still firmly in the driving seat. There are a few incremental changes that happened. A truce held somewhat since Feb 27th, but Assad is going to break it and break it spectacularly with a massive operation in Aleppo. I have to say that Stefan de Mistura has exceeded expectations. This is an extremely difficult job. But has anything changed?
Yeah, but the bar was so low.
Yes, the bar is very low.
He's exceeded expectations just by getting people not around the same table, but in the same building.
No.
Proximity talks.
Indirect talks. Yeah, that's what we've been talking about since the beginning.
Absolutely. And of course, it's basically the Saudi backers that have got all the opposition groups together. So no, fundamentally nothing has changed. But I mean, we can't take our eyes off this because there are so many lives at stake. And there is a push to have some sort of end game at this. Now, if Assad is going to take Aleppo, that is going to change the dynamic of what's going to happen on the ground.
Okay, and I guess that's the question. Are circumstances changing that can perhaps pave the way for some kind of resolution?
I'd agree with the yes and no. Obviously, these talks are not going to end up with a solid and sustainable peace agreement. But first of all, the conditions that were put in place to have these talks were very important. The ceasefire, for instance, allowed not a huge amount, but the beginnings of some humanitarian aid to the populations that have been under siege. That's very important. The second thing is that with the quieting of the guns, not the silencing, but the quieting of the guns, a lot of allegiances under fire turned out to be not as strong especially among the rebel groups, between, for instance, very extremist jihadist groups and non-extremist jihadist groups or moderate groups. Those allegiances under fire turned out to be not very strong during peacetime. So you had some demonstrations against the Al-Nusra Front, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, by civilians. You had certain rebel groups that had been cooperating against the regime, but when the guns quieted, realized that they have very little in common. So that's very important too, because it clarifies things in terms of negotiating. And then the final thing is, it's very easy to be cynical about these talks and these processes. And I'm usually the one who's kind of the cold-hearted cynic or realist at the table. But the truth is that if there is going to be a peace agreement, it's going to have to start with something that resembles what we have today. And they come when people when the people firing the guns on the ground decide that they can't win through the force of arms and that they're just tired of bleeding. And when that happens, then you have people that are willing to make compromises. It's not quite there yet. Everyone around Syria wants this to end. Everyone around Syria, their interest is to end this, way more than to continue it. Now the question is, how far has that settled in within Syria? And as this progresses, you'll see more and more compromise.
I don't think it's a given that everybody around Syria wants to end it. I mean, I think, yes, Jordan would like to end it, Lebanon would like to end it, but the key players, I'm not sure Saudi Arabia is dying to end it. I'm not sure that Iran is dying to end it.
I think Russia is dying.
I think
it does
Russia,
not
I don't
want
think
to
Russia wants to fight endlessly here, but I think this is a proxy war. And what's happening here is the proxies are all dying, but the people who are pushing the proxies are not, and they're not threatened. So I think that that's one of the dangers of a proxy war, as we saw, for instance, through 15 years in Lebanon, is they can just go on and on and on as long as the proxies are willing to fuel the fighting. And so you have to deal at the level, and that's one of the things these peace talks are about. That's not just about the parties on the ground. It's about the parties behind those parties and getting them to come into some sort of arrangement where they would make a deal.
I think, though, I agree with you, but at the same time, I think that what we've seen, especially with regard to Russia and America, is that there's been some arm twisting. The Saudis shepherding all of the rebel groups to try and have a united, organized front at the negotiating table was not out of the goodwill of the Saudis. I think I think that had a good amount to do with Washington pressuring them. And I'm not sure. It's very opaque what Iran's interest is. I'm not sure that they have the resources to keep supporting Assad and to keep sending the kind of weapons.
At some point, we may see a
financial
divergence between Iran and Russia. I mean, I don't think Russia has a particular interest in Assad, qua Assad, or the Alawites as Alawites. Iran does.
So what's Russia? It's kind of difficult to understand what Russia is trying to achieve by first sending a massive amount of military firepower in Syria and then withdrawing it before, quote unquote, the job is done. So they allow the Syrian government to conquer several towns, to gain ground, but then they withdraw before Aleppo is securely in government control. What's this balancing act about?
Well, I think it is precisely that, a balancing act. They want to project, Putin wants to project Russia's power and Putin's power in the theater that is Syria, and he saw a vacuum there, a vacuum of leadership, of American leadership, European leadership, and regional leadership. So he said, okay, I can move in here. I have a plan. In fact, his solution is, let's save Assad long enough to make a deal. And that is
his plan is a deal. You mean a peace deal for Syria?
Yeah,
absolutely.
All right. Absolutely.
So that gets back to
what I
my
was saying about the difference between the Iranian plan and the Russian.
But that gets back to my question
the Russian
earlier.
Intervention was not massive. It was very calculated. It was actually very cost efficient, and it had very limited goals. It was to save Assad, who seemed to be at the point of collapsing at that point, and just to maintain their interests at the Russia's interests. They need Assad's regime for now. Once Russia's interests are secured, I agree, Assad is no longer necessary.
But hence my earlier question, if Russia, which is one of the key players here, has a plan and it wants a peace deal, then how come none of you around this table seem confident that there is going to be a peace deal relatively soon?
I think what Russia would also be willing to work with is some sort of federalism where they split up the areas. Russia is heavily backing the Kurds and they would not mind some sort of autonomy of the Kurdish region. I think Russia would be willing to settle for that.
Well, it's possible, but the other problem is this question of client states and clients. Assad is a client of Russia, but he's a problematic one. He has his own goals. There was a certain point where, again, Russia withdrew some of its forces, not all of them, and actually redeployed others. But there was some conjecture that they pulled out when they did because Assad was feeling too secure and was making statements along the lines of not negotiating it at all. So,
I mean, the bottom line is Russia has a comprehensible policy. Almost nobody else does. In Syria.
We continue to talk about Russia. Vladimir Putin held his annual marathon press conference earlier this week, taking questions on all topics, from Syria to the Panama Papers to his personal life. it's hard to even know where to start. Michael Stothard, when you see this kind of press conference, does it make you regret that you're a Paris correspondent and not a Moscow correspondent?
It was more fun than Hollande's. It was more fun than Hollande's. It was kind of Chavez-esque in its.
Oh, those used to last hours.
In its.
I fell asleep in one of those. True story.
I know. I thought the stuff on the Panama Papers was some of the most interesting. I thought his tough line on it being Western conspiracy was, I thought, quite strong.
All right, let's hear it from the man himself, Vladimir Putin, on hitting back after the Panama Papers revelations that his inner circle had hidden vast amounts of money.
Provocations. We know that among them there are staff of official US institutions. Süddeutsche Zeitung is part of a media holding which belongs to the US financial corporation Goldman Sachs. There are signs of the instigator everywhere, and they're completely shameless.
And he has actually apologized since then for the remark on the German daily, the Süddeutsche Zeitung. It doesn't belong to Goldman Sachs. He admitted as much. All right, Michael.
Well, he came out fighting, really, which I thought which is as you'd expect of a man who wrestles bears and as you say, as we were saying earlier, has popularity of 85%. It was punchy, but and he's not really under pressure. The revelations that some cellist close to him had lots of money, could look bad if you know about how about how people hide money in this era, which is actually not to put it under your own name, but put it in an offshore bank account. Actually, the best way is to give it to a friend in the kind of old school mafia style where, the casinos in Las Vegas are owned by, your maid, but actually. So that is how people hide money.
And the Financial Times reporter should know, by the way.
I set up my own offshore companies as in an investigation into this. Anyway, so So I was speaking to corporate spooks who were telling me how the pros do it. It's not how I was doing it, which was setting up my own companies. Is you just get someone else to do it, and then you're much, 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 much better protected.
You've since lost all your billions.
I've lost all my billions. Anyway, so we know that that's how people do it, but can you really trace it back to Putin? And does anyone in Russia really care? Absolutely not.
And
do they really know?
Dare?
And that as well.
Or do they dare to challenge him on that?
Yeah. Do they dare to really do the kind of investigative work that would trace it back to him if that could be done? I think there's a real question. I mean, one of the things that Putin did recently was to reorganize the police and security forces to make it an enormous Praetorian Guard, like 400,000 police and security forces now who answer to whom, speaking of friends, to his bodyguard.
Not to the cellist.
Not to the
The thing is, though, I didn't actually see the press conference, but I read some write-ups, and it appears that he was a little less boastful or proud about, or at the very least, he had to actually respond to concerns. People are Russia has been in a recession now for the past year and a half. A lot of the moves that he's made, especially the sanctions that he brought on Russia through the intervention in Ukraine, and even the military operation in Syria, has some costs. The Russian people are suffering, and so they support him. They're happy. They like the fact that Russia is back in the spotlight and is a global player, but they want to make a living as well. And he actually had to respond to questions about quality of life and the recession, and he did straightforwardly. One thing that I thought was interesting.
Hey, we have less than a minute left, and nobody is telling me about Vladimir Putin's personal life and his wife or not his wife, and is he going to get married? So,
is this Wendy Deng?
Nobody took an interest.
He didn't want to respond to that because he was afraid of the impact it might have on international markets. So.
As the woman here,
there you go. Thank you.
This question is always asked by a lady at these pressers. So, no marks for his gender rights record.
One less playful note, though. One thing he did say that caught my attention, especially contrasted to Hollande and a lot of the American campaign rhetoric. He talked about when people said that he talked about tightening belts and facing a tough time. straightforwardly in a way that Western politicians don't normally do, and
Because
that really jumped out. He can, but he also it was noteworthy.
Also a warning of things to come, certainly on the economic front for Russians. I'd like to thank all our guests for joining us on the World this week. Always a pleasure to have you. We're going to take a very short break. Emma James joins us now for Media Watch. You've been watching the media, as it were. What are we talking about right now? You've been taking a look at Germany, for instance, giving the green light to prosecutors to pursue a case against a comedian who insulted Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, who we're talking about in the news. He was furious.
Yes, and this is something that really seems to have angered a lot of people. And taking a look online, everyone seems to have an opinion on this one. This particular cartoon came from Ausgezeichnet, a German publication, and it shows Angela Merkel presenting the head of Jan Böhmermann's, the comedian who read this poem that was so insulting on air. She's presenting his head on a plate to the Turkish president. And it is rather apt that he has a very sort of regal appearance in this particular cartoon, because this is all about lèse-majesté, the idea that injured majesty, it's against the law basically in Germany for people to insult heads of state from foreign lands.
It's against the law, but it's up to the Chancellor to decide whether or not to instruct the prosecutor to go ahead.
Exactly.
She didn't have to do that.
Angela Merkel has decided that it will go ahead. She says it doesn't mean there's been any kind of judgment on the part of the government in Germany. It is for the prosecutors to choose whether or not they go ahead with the case, and they won't, the government will not interfere any further beyond what they have already done. But that still is enough to have upset a great many people, as you might imagine. Looking at The Atlantic's take on this one, they basically say that this explicit poem that was read out, and it was extremely explicit. We're talking about him calling Erdogan a paedophile, saying that he had sex with goats. And he said at the beginning, he knew that he was going beyond the bounds of what was permitted by law in Germany. And it seems that Merkel has agreed with them, because The Atlantic says she defended an earlier satirical song, which was the whole reason why Böhmermann decided to do this. The German ambassador was called in by Ankara to explain about why this was allowed to happen. It was in much milder terms. Merkel defended that one, but she said this poem was deliberately offensive. Yet it was aired on ZDF, one of the major, national broadcasters in Germany. So it does seem very strange, this one, but obviously lots of people not too happy about it. Freedom of the press, not in Germany, a big slap round the face there from Batman. Why did Erdogan cross the road to prosecute the German comedian? Let's put this up at the Belgian border, says this Twitter user, comedians welcome. And he's used the hashtag Je suis Böhmermann, obviously an echo of Je suis Charlie. And again, we're talking about freedom of speech. So that is something that's taken hold quite a lot on Twitter. We're seeing a lot of those hashtags. And people really pointing out freedom of expression, vive la liberté, but not in Germany. Others saying Merkel is a hypocrite. Putting the Je suis Böhmermann tweet hashtag there alongside the photograph of her on the freedom of speech march that was held in Paris in the wake of those attacks on the offices of Charlie Hebdo, the satirical magazine here. Now, with all these references to Charlie Hebdo, one thing that I found quite interesting was it's an opinion of an ordinary German blogger. But what she talks about is who this guy is, Jan Böhmermann, because obviously we've not heard of him until now. And what she says is that he's kind of like John Oliver, the American comedian, but without the empathy, the passion to educate on ambiguous topics, and generally the goodwill to make things better. Jan Böhmermann is basically a dude who puts out ironic viral videos in an attempt to show that he is above everything and the coolest dude who ever lived. Now, she accuses him of not even having strong opinions, that he solely sets out to rile people up, get them fired up, and that anyone who attacks him, well, it's that old thing, if you don't like it, you just don't understand it.
Elsewhere, you're also looking at this unusual, unexpected collaboration between a French musician and an American whistleblower.
Yes, just very quickly, I can tell you about this. Jean-Michel Jarre has teamed up with Edward Snowden. It does seem like a strange kind of happening. It's all courtesy of the Guardian newspaper. They put the pair in touch because Jean-Michel Jarre is a self-professed professed big fan of Edward Snowden. Now, the track Exit is about to be released this weekend. We've got a bit of a teaser video to show you to give you an idea of just what it's going to be like. Let's take a listen.
Hi, my name's Edward Snowden.
So there you go. No singing from Edward Snowden, but he will be starring in vocal form, speaking on the track. And this Twitter user says, Edward Snowden is about to drop a techno track so insane, no wonder he was granted asylum.
All right, Emma James with Media Watch. Thank you very much. Thanks again to our guests for joining us this evening on France 24. Thank you for watching us. We take a very short break. Do stay tuned. More world news right after this.